take take the patient and the result of patient, and you can study about the specific disease. And you have the result, and you have a.
Yes, very good. If you want to make a summary, you can say that case control study is a kind of a study that starts with selecting some cases and selecting some controls. We know who are diseased and who are not diseased at the beginning of the study. And after that, we can ask them about the previous history of exposure, and we can compare the percentages of the exposure, for example, smoking among disease with the percentage of exposure among non-disease. Okay, but it is the same. Okay. Always we have one problem. Today the problem is it. Okay. And the other important point for case control study was being unable to provide information about prevalence of disease in our study population. Why? As we reviewed, as we mentioned, the prevalence of disease is in our hands, is under the control of researcher to, for example, select some cases and some controls, so we cannot provide information about silence.
حبطنا بس
Okay. Some main points we have to plan a case control study. In cross-sectional study, I made you an example, and I told you that we can go, for example, to the university and select our study based on the distribution of sex, based on the distribution of majors, carriers, I mean, that the students have in the university. But how about case control study? We should prepare our research question. We should select the cases and we should select the controls. But how? We are going to review these important points. Research question. A research question should be a list of hypotheses that can be tested. Okay? For example, does smoking cigarettes cause bronchogenic carcinoma? It is a kind of research question. What is dependent variable? I told you.
Smoker.
Huh?
Smoker.
Dependent. No. Bronchogenic carcinoma is dependent because we want to study the effect of smoking on it. So it is dependent to the smoking. So our disease is dependent variable, but how about independent variable? It is cigarette smoking. So independent variable is our exposure. Okay? But dependent variable is our disease of interest. Okay? Selecting cases. We can select cases from different locations, and we should have we should be cautious about the definition of case. What do I mean? Please see. Sources go to the hospitals and select your cases from hospitals, or you can go to the outpatient centers, for example, physicians' offices or healthcare centers, and invite the sick population to participate into your study. Okay? These are the sources, the different sources to capture, to find the cases. But sometimes we can go and use the forms of registries. For example, cancer registry forms. Yes? We can go to the registry centers and ask the responsible officer to give us the registries. For example, the name of different patients for different cancers. Okay? And we can select randomly from that forms, that registry centers. But sometimes that was source of cases. But how about definition of case? We can use incident or prevalent cases. For example, I want to plan a case control study to investigate the association between breast cancer and, for example, blood pressure. Okay? What is dependent variable here in this example? Blood pressure and breast cancer. What is dependent?
Cancer.
Breast cancer, because I told you that disease is dependent variable. What is independent? Hypertension, because we want to investigate the association of hypertension and the effect of hypertension on breast cancer. Okay? Sometimes we can go to the, for example, healthcare center or the hospital and ask the available cases of breast cancer. It is prevalent or incidence? Sorry. Prevalent case, because they are already diseased. Yes? But sometimes we want to use incident cases. What does it mean? I can stay in the center and wait for the newly diagnosed breast cancers that are attending in that center and invite them to participate in our study. What is the difference between these two approaches? Is there any difference or no? There is no difference. They are breast cancer patients and they are breast cancer patients as well.
I think the time, and we don't know what
the stage of cancer.
The state of
Cancer
the state of cancer.
Yes.
What do you mean?
I think someone have cancer, but in the first, yes, and someone have cancer, but I think
someone had the cancer, it's just started, and other have it's already separate further. So the first one it has possibility to recover from that one, but the next one he doesn't have.
But is there any necessity to have, for example, milder cases in the incident case scenario? Because sometimes the patient might be delayed and the stage is higher. Yes? So the other difference. Comment.
I think
You are silent. Why?
Yeah, I should give the chance for the others.
Uh-huh.
I've been answering for the past 2 days.
Uh-huh. All of us should
Participate.
speak.
I
I motivate all of you to speak and to be active in the class, because through this way you can think and you can learn better. Okay? If I speak if I only speak, it is not appropriate for teaching. So all of you should speak. Okay?
I think that because we're talking about incidents and prevalent cases, they have a difference. Because prevalent, it can be divided into 2 parts, right? There is a point prevalence, and I think there's
Period.
No.
Briefly.
It is in the individual level.
Period.
Maybe
We are not going to the community about the point prevalence or something like that. That prevalence refers to the number of cases in the community. But here I speak for one person, and for example, I want to ask that patient to come to my study. Okay? So, is there any difference regarding the available cases in the registries and the patients who are newly diagnosed?
I think just you are will be boring waiting the new one.
Yes,
Yeah.
very good. It is a disadvantage of incident case
But we have already
because it takes time to stay and wait for
new one to
newly diagnosed patients. But please consider the form that is available for cancer patients. All of them are alive, or some of them have died.
Yeah, someone.
Some of them have died. And you do not have a chance who there died.
No one is.
Or severe, yes,
Older.
and some patients with some specific characteristics have died. And you have no chance to select them and enter them into your study. So, in this type of case definition, you have just milder cases who lived longer, who survived longer. So, if you want to find the etiology of a disease, the cause of a disease, it is not good. Because in this way, you can find some causes that are related to the survival time, not to the incidence, not to the occurrence of disease. But in the incident case, you have some severe cases, you have some mild cases. It is mixed. You have the chance to find both severe and both mild cases. Okay? So if you want to find the etiology of the disease, it is better to use the incident cases in case control studies. But it has some disadvantages. Like time consuming.
Yes, time.
Yes? And for example, the cost would be higher. It is expensive, more expensive than the prevalent case. But in prevalent case, it is easy. You can call and ask the survived patient, the live patient, to come to your study. So these two approaches are different, and we can use these two in different scenarios based on the objectives that we are going to address. Okay? Prevalent cases, disadvantages, highly non-representative group of cases, as I told you, because mostly the prevalent cases that are are alive have suffered from milder diseases, okay? So they are non-representative, but the advantage is taking less time. But about incident cases, it is preferable to find disease etiology, and disadvantage is time consuming. Okay. How about selecting controls? If I ask you about selecting cases and selecting controls, which is more difficult? Control?
No.
Selecting what?
Selecting cases or selecting controls? Which is more difficult? Selecting controls? The other opinions? Cases? Why? Why and why? A chance. Since she told that cases, you can controls, you can say cases. Just to be different. Yes? Okay. And how about you?
Like, we can control the disease, but selecting is like everything.
Uh-huh. Who are diseased? We have one disease, and we know who are diseased. But we have so many types of controls. How we can select our controls from the community? Because the majority of our community are controls. The number of cases are limited, and we can select the cases through that limited number easily. But the controls have so variety, and it is important to select appropriate control. Here you can see the importance of selecting appropriate control. In this example, in this experience, you can see in 1929, a professor of biostatistics at Johns Hopkins University conducted a study to test the hypothesis that tuberculosis protected against cancer. What a strange hypothesis. No? At that moment, autopsy was so common. More than 7,500 consecutive autopsies at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He identified this number of cases, 860. Okay? After that, he tried to find that number of controls. From whom? From the patients who did not suffer from cancer. Okay? So, he had 816 number of cases that came from autopsy, yes, and 816 number of controls among autopsies without cancers. Okay? And after that, he tried to find the evidence of tuberculosis. He tested for tuberculosis among those autopsies. Okay? He saw that 6.6% of cases had tuberculosis, but 16% of controls had tuberculosis as well. What is the result? What is the interpretation based on this result?
People who have tuberculosis are less likely to have cancer.
Uh-huh.
Because only 6.6% of the autopsies with tuberculosis had cancer, as 16% of those who had tuberculosis did not have cancer.
Is it direct association or indirect?
Indirect. Because it's not.
Indirect.
Yeah.
It means that higher tuberculosis, less chance of cancer. It means that tuberculosis may protect
Maybe.
from taking cancer. Yes?
Yes.
But is it true?
No.
No.
Based on our science, based on our logic,
No.
it seems not true. But at that moment, it was the evidence, it was the result of a very famous study at Johns Hopkins, and it was the basic of injecting BCG as a kind of protecting tuberculosis at that moment. But after a while, another physician tried to confirm the results. How? He selected some other complex. He thought that at that moment, Johns Hopkins was a referral hospital to hospitalize patients with tuberculosis. It means that in that hospital, the percentage of tuberculosis was higher than the community. It means that the controls that were hospitalized in Johns Hopkins University, Johns Hopkins Hospital, were not representative to the whole community regarding the percentage of tuberculosis. Could you consider this situation? Is it clear for you or not?
No.
No? Okay. Please let me show what. You have different wards in a hospital, okay? They are cancer patients, all of them. They are cancer patients, and we have the other wards that patients were hospitalized in those wards because of tuberculosis and because of the complications of tuberculosis, because that hospital was a referral hospital for tuberculosis and the complications of tuberculosis. So, in the community, for example, the prevalence, thank you. In the community, for example, the prevalence of tuberculosis, let's say, for example, 10%. Okay? But here, it means that out of 100, for example, 10 have tuberculosis. Okay? But here, since the center is referral for tuberculosis, among non-cancer patients, the rate of tuberculosis is higher than the community. Why? Because the reason for hospitalization was tuberculosis. there is association between exposure and disease. So, in this scenario, the percentage of tuberculosis among cancer is the same as the community. Why? Because they had cancer. It is not related to tuberculosis. For example, 10%. But among non-cancer patients, mostly were infected by tuberculosis because the reason of hospitalization at that hospital was tuberculosis. So 50% of non-cancer patients were infected by tuberculosis based on this type of control that was not representative of total population in the community based on the characteristic of the hospital. He showed that the percentage of TB in non-cancer patients is higher, and so interpreted that tuberculosis may protect from taking cancer. But it is not true because it is related to the inappropriate control group that he took. Okay? After a while, another scientist tried to replicate the study, and he used this number of cases, but selected another type of controls from there, from the cardiovascular ward of hospital that was not related to tuberculosis. Okay? And he saw that there is no difference between the percentage of tuberculosis in cases and control. So there was no association between tuberculosis and cancer. So it shows us that the importance that selecting control is so important. It is an evidence of the importance of selecting appropriate controls. Okay? Please think about a hypothesis that I have. Please guide me to select good cases and good controls. Okay? I want to test a hypothesis regarding the association between coffee consumption and cardiovascular disease. I want to select my cases from hospital. How can I select my cases?
You will look for patients with
I can go to hospital and go to the which ward?
to this
Which
cardiovascular.
section? To the cardiovascular section. I can ask, for example, I can use the prevalent approach or newly diagnosed or incident cases approach. In prevalent cases, I can go to the responsible officer of the ward and ask for all patients that are available right now and all patients that were hospitalized, for example, through 3 months ago. Okay? And select them to participate and ask them to participate in my study. And how about controls? How can I select my controls? Please assume that I go to the Department of Gastroenterology. Okay? And I ask that Department of Internal Medicine, the ward of Internal Medicine at that hospital, and ask them to introduce some non-CDB cases. Okay? After my study, I show you that there is no difference or maybe protective effect of very high and a strong association between coffee consumption and CBD. Why? Because I showed you that 20% of CBD patients are using coffee, but 2% of that control have exposure. And I say, I tell you that there is a strong association between coffee consumption and CBD. But you tell me that your result is not true. Why? Because at that department, at that ward, based on the problem of gastritis, the internal medicine, the physician, recommended the patients not to use coffee because it is harmful for their gastrointestinal system. So, since the coffee consumption as an exposure in my control is restricted based on the recommendation of physician, you may have a strong difference between the percentage of exposure, coffee consumption in CBD and in your control group, but it is not true. Why? Because the percentage of coffee consumption in the community is not 2%. It means that my control group is not representative for the control group outside the hospital. How can I solve this problem? I can go to another ward that has no association with limitation or increasing of coffee consumption. I should use a control group that is representative of my total population. For example, I can go to orthopedy, to the ward of orthopedy, and use, for example, some patients with fracture. Because there is no previous recommendation of quitting or increasing consumption of coffee among those patients. So I think that the exposure prevalence, the prevalence of coffee consumption among those patients is similar to that in the general population in the community. So I can use that patient as my control. Okay? Is it
Yes.
understandable? Okay. So, the way the controls are selected is a major determinant of whether such a conclusion is valid. Okay? Which conclusion? About the hypothesis of tuberculosis and cancer. That slide was related to the previous example. Okay? Sources of controls. I told you the importance of selecting appropriate controls. But how we can select appropriate controls? Which sources are available? Some of them come from general population. How can I select our control from general population? What do I mean?
From the community, go to a neighborhood and ask.
For example, I want to find the association between coffee consumption and CBD. I go to the hospital and ask some CBD patients as cases, and I want to select some controls. I can go to, for example, the neighborhood of that of those patients.
Coffee shop.
Coffee shop?
To ask the patient, someone drink coffee.
But,
You have a.
but in coffee shop, the percentage of using consumption of coffee is higher than general population. Yes, it is not representative. You should not go to the center that is highly associated with the exposure. You should go to the community. For example, you should go to the university. You should go to some offices. You should randomly call based on digit number. You can call, for example, and ask some people. You can go to the neighborhood. For example, if a patient resides in, for example, Karager Street, you can go to Karager Street and ask some neighborhoods to be a control of us, okay? Or ask, for example, family members. Sometimes you can ask friends. Sometimes you can ask, for example, colleagues, okay? These types of controls are population-based, okay? I want to ask a question. Okay, would you please answer to my question? Okay? What is population-based control?
Control the level based on an advantage of the population.
What was my example regarding coffee consumption and CBD? What was the population-based control at that example? I try to do my best, and I want you to listen to my speaking. You have time to do all things that you want to do after the class, but it is the time of class. If the class is not appropriate, is not good, and the lesson is not good for you, we can finish our class right now.
No.
Okay. Is there anybody to answer to the question?
So we said in population control, we have to dial random numbers, go to office, universities, schools, and someone mentioned coffee shops, but you said that we can't use coffee shops because it has high consumption of coffee regarding to the community.
Okay, very good. It depends. Using control group depends on the objective of the study. What do I a nutrition material. For example, coffee consumption and cardiovascular disease. It is not good to use friends or, for example, family member. Why? Because the nutritional habits are the same in family members, somehow the same in family members or in friends. In this situation, it is better to go out, for example, and use random digit number and call population, or go to the neighborhood. Okay? But sometimes the exposure of interest is something that is, for example, related to genetic, for example. In this situation, we can use friend because there is no association between genetic and, for example, being friend. In that status, we can use, for example, spouses, but we cannot use sibling because they are similar to each other. So this slide shows you the ability to select from different sources. But depending on the objective of your study, you should select one control group. Okay? You cannot do it by yourself. You should be familiar with these subjects. We cannot expect you to design a very suitable and appropriate study based on this class, but it is being familiar to this concept. That is enough. It has so many challenges, okay? But you should be familiar with those challenges, with the principles of developing case control study, and can interpret the result of those studies in the future. Why is it important? Because you are a physician. You want to use, for example, and read the papers. Yes? You should interpret the results of papers. You should be cautious about the result, about the challenges, about the interpretation of the result, about the misconception of some results or something like that. Okay? Sometimes we can use hospital-based controls. I told you an example about selecting cases from cardiovascular disease ward and control from, for example, orthopedic fracture ward. Okay? It is a kind of hospital-based. Sometimes you go to the general community, to the community and select general population, and sometimes you can use hospital-based controls. Okay? The degree of accuracy in measuring the exposure for cases should be equivalent to degree of accuracy for controls. What do I mean? What was the logic of case control study? What was the way of understanding the result, finding the result?
To understand the prevalence?
How we can show that there is association between exposure, and this is in case control study. Why?
Seeing the prevalence in the case control and seeing the prevalence
Of course,
in the
yes.
non-control.
Yes, I showed you this slide. We selected some we select some cases, we select some controls, and after that we compare the proportion of exposure among cases and controls. Okay? So, how can we find the percentage of exposure among cases and controls? Sometimes by asking questions. For example, are you smoking or not? Okay? If the accuracy of question or the ways to find exposure is not the same in cases and controls. For example, I asked for example, do you have exposure with, for example, X-ray? He said no,
Okay.
his case. And I think hypothesis is relation between X-ray and, for example, cancer. I ask again, are you sure? Please think about it. He think more. No, I have no exposure. Please remember, did you work, for example, at that region that is highly probable to have exposure? Think about it. Yes, I work at that company and we have exposure with X-ray. But how about control? His control is healthy, and my hypothesis is association between X-ray and being control. So I do not expect for control to have exposure, okay? I ask him, do you have exposure with X-ray? He says, no. I can pass and go to the next one. The accuracy of asking a question is not similar for cases and controls. Or sometimes I can send the cases, for example, for more tests to confirm some exposure. But I can pass from the controls because I think that there is no exposure among them. This makes a very strong error in my study result. So the accuracy in measuring the exposure for cases and controls should be the same. Okay? The number of controls to select per case is different. In that example, we had 200 cases and 400 controls.
Yes.
And I asked you about the number of controls per each case. It was 2. Sometimes we can use more controls. For example, 3 controls per each case. Or 4 controls for each case. Why do we use this imbalance selection of cases and controls?
Have an accurate reading of the general population, because if you had one control for each case, then it would seem as though 50% of the population have this disease.
To have like reliable results.
We do not, you know that we cannot say anything about the prevalence of disease in case control study.
Yes, but you need more control so that you can have more accurate results, because otherwise you are comparing one person with one person, and when you want to work with the general population, something related to that, you're comparing one person, on average to all of the population, so you should have more than one control.
You think that since controls are have higher number, it is better to have higher number in our it is not the reason exactly for selecting more controls. The main reason is having no access to enough number of cases in the community. Sometimes we have some limited number of cases. For example, based on statistical calculation, we need to have, for example, 400 cases and 400 controls. It means that our total sample size is 800. But we do not have access to 400 number of cases because usually the number of cases are limited in our community. So we can decrease the number of cases and increase the number of controls and compensate this decrease, this reduction by increasing the number of controls. Some simulation studies showed that until 1 and 4 controls for each case, you can increase the power of your study. But after that, you cannot increase the power. So the maximum number of controls per each case is 4. Okay? If you select more controls over 4, it is wasting your budget. Okay? It cannot increase the power of your study. Okay? So the rule of thumb: maximum 4 cases for 4 controls for 1 case. Sometimes we have less control and higher cases. In each situation we can do this. The controls, the cases are common, and the cases are common, but the tests and the examination for confirming cases and confirming exposure among cases are so expensive. You know, among cases, all tests should be done necessarily during the process of identification and treatment. But for controls, we should do this test and this examination by hours, and the cost is related to us for controls. But for cases, they themselves pay for such examination, for such tests. Okay? Sometimes the tests are so expensive and we cannot afford to, for example, select 2 or 3 controls per each case. In this situation, we can select less control and more cases. Okay? Is it true or not?
Can you say this part again? Can you repeat this again?
Yes. Usually we have more controls and less cases. Maximum number of controls per each case is 4. But in rare situations, we can use more cases and less controls. Why? Because of shortcoming in the cost. Because cases are doing their measurements by themselves, because it is necessary for their treatment, for their diagnosis, etc., etc. But we should pay for controls by ourselves. If we do not have enough money and we have access to more cases, we can increase the number of cases and lower the number of controls. Okay? Sometimes we have different types of controls for each case. I told you the number of controls per each case, yes? But sometimes the type of controls might be different. I mean that one control from, for example, friends, one control from family member, one control from neighborhood, and one control from hospital, for example, for each case. It is multiple controls with multiple types. But after the study, you can find, for example, if you are lucky, each control has the same result. For example, direct association between exposure and disease in neighborhood control, direct association between exposure and disease in friends control, direct association between case and control using, for example, family member, and also with hospital-based control. You're lucky. All results are similar together. But sometimes the result of friend control is inverse, and the result of family member, for example, is direct. And there is no association between case and control when you use, for example, hospital-based. How can you report these different results? What is your main result finally? If you do not have gold standard at the beginning of a study, you may report just the one result that is parallel with your idea. It is a kind of error. So you should define your gold standard and make it clear in your proposal that my gold standard, of course, I have multiple type of controls, but my gold standard is, for example, friend control. And if there is different results based on different type of controls, you can say that, okay, my main result is this, but the other group has, for example, different results as blah, blah, blah. Okay? It is multiple control. Okay.
How can I identify which one is better from this control? Yeah. Which result?
It is very challenging question and very good question. You should take some points into consideration. For example, what is the risk factor, the potential risk factor that you are going to target? For example, I told you, if it is a genetic factor, you cannot use family member. Why? Because all of them are the same. Okay? Or if you want to find, for example, the nutrition, you cannot go to family member because family member always use the same meal. Okay? Sometimes you want to, for example, work with the exposure is air pollution. Having neighborhood control is not good because they live in some region that air pollution is similar for them. So, based on the exposure that you are interested in, you can find the best control group. Okay? To be more fresh, I can ask you a question. Okay?
To be more fresh, we can take a rest.
Take a rest. Really? Are you tired?
Yes.
But if I let you go out, you never come back on time. Okay. If you promise that you are coming back on time, I can let you go.
How much is the lecture left?
Uh-huh.
How much or is it?
Very much.
Okay.